Society built up its collections, collection, and one of our prized possessions, which perhaps you have heard of, is Dante's, a manuscript of Dante's Divine Comedy. It's beautifully written. The calligraphy is beautiful, the illustrations are beautiful. And this was just given to us by Mount Stuart Elphinstone, besides many others books in his collection. This, as I said, is one of our prized possessions. And then we have all these valuable manuscripts, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and you should see how on papyrus, some of them are on old paper, and they are in those, like wooden slats. So actually a lot of those also now need to be looked at afresh. They need to be restored. We certainly don't want to lose what the original has been protected and kept for so long. But for manuscript restoration, you really need someone highly trained to deal with that. But otherwise, we have competent people who are busy with restoration work. We have what we call adopt a book scheme, so that our old books, which need to be restored and in a sense given fresh life, are dealt with by trained staff. We have a good laboratory. We have some labs in our basement, the conservation lab and the bindery, and a lot of work is done there. And I must say that we've been able to do that with very, very generous help from the Rotary Club of Bombay that helped to put up, to modernize our laboratories. So see, as an institution, the only way we can really move forward is if we get help from the public, from generous donors. We do get a grant from the ministry, from Delhi, that is the Culture Ministry, but the government also has its constraints and they are not really able to be more generous with us. And as things get more expensive and interest rates go down so that our investments are not bringing in as much as they did, we are literally unable to function unless we can get more support. But we're doing our best. And one of those efforts is what in these times when we can't meet physically, is what people like Shehnaz Nalwala with her Mumbai Research Centre and her very, very able team have been doing by making these presentations, giving these, organizing these lectures, doing a lot of courses that people from all over the world are now joining, because that's one advantage that when we do things online, there are no geographical restraints and people can join from anywhere. And as you all know today, those who are already present must have joined from many places, not necessarily in Mumbai alone. And even in Mumbai, maybe living far away, but able to join thanks to, as we said, these technological resources.
Vespi, we can start now if you like.
Okay, Farokh, if it's okay.
Yes, hi, Farokh.
Yeah, he's ready. He's ready.
Ready?
Are you sure, Farokh?
Ready, steady, go.
Okay, thank you. So we've been given the green signal, and Shehnaz, back to you. Madhu, Shehnaz?
Yeah. Yes. Good evening, everyone. And let me begin with a very, very big apology for this little goof up on time. But I think we have now spent this time very productively, where people have been told about what Asiatic is all about. So apologies and thank you for bearing with us. And with these few words, I wish all of you all a very good evening and welcome you to this much awaited session by Dr. Farokh Udwadia on Medicine in Bombay Through the Ages. The Mumbai Research Centre of the Asiatic Society is constantly exploring new themes, ideas, and initiatives to keep alive the interest of the people of the city as far as the city is concerned and its various activities are concerned. On the occasion of National Doctors' Day, we thought of having this session on medicine in Bombay. And who better than the doyen of the art of healing and tabiat, and that is Dr. Farokh Udwadia. We also take this opportunity today to say a big thank you to all the doctors, health workers, and frontline workers for their hard work and dedication at all times, and especially now during this pandemic. A big thank you to all of you who make miracles happen every moment. I now invite Mr. Navroz Sirvai, Senior Counsel and one of the trustees of the Asiatic Society, to speak a little, tell us a little bit about Farokh Udwadia, and then I will request Doctor to please take over. Thank you so much. Mr. Sirvai. Mr. Sirvai.
A minute, ma'am. I muted everyone. Let me unmute him.
No, but he's the co-host, so.
He's not co-host, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, he's unmuted.
Huh? Yeah.
Sir is unmuted.
Yeah, Mr. Sirvai, please take over.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm both delighted and honored to say a few words about a man who can only be described as a legend in his lifetime. It is really not for me to introduce Dr. Udwadia, because if ever there is a hackneyed cliche that somebody doesn't need to be introduced, it's the doctor. And so I'll just say a few words that come to my mind over years and years of being privileged to have known Dr. Udwadia. Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, said that talent hits that which no one else can hit. Genius hits that which no one else can see. If the target for a physician is to diagnose the ailment which brings the patient to a doctor, then I think Dr. Udwadia fits the bill. He hits that which no one else can see. And the stories and anecdotes of his having diagnosed what ails a patient when no one else has been able to do so are legendary. His achievements and the honors bestowed on him are well known, and I would not like to take up time in enumerating them. But I do think that to talk of Dr. Udwadia only in terms of his chosen profession is to do him a disservice. Dr. Udwadia represents what classically can be called the Renaissance man. Science and the arts are one. Science depends on art, art depends on science. That was the theme of the Renaissance, whether it was Leonardo or the other great men of the Renaissance. And Dr. Udwadia practices that. He is a lover and connoisseur of music, but he doesn't leave it at that. He is himself a violinist. He loves reading biography and history, but he doesn't leave it at that. He is himself an author and a writer. His eclectic interests are manifold and wide, and that is evident from the subjects on which he has written books, learned, scholarly books. And therefore, without more, let me hand over to the legend whom you are all interested in hearing. I can only say one more thing. When Leonardo da Vinci applied to the Duke of Milan in 1482 for a job, he gave 10 descriptions of himself as an architect, an engineer, a scientist, etc. And he ended that letter by saying, I can also paint. I think Dr. Udwadia could, I say this in a slightly lighter vein, given his manifold interests, say that I also practice medicine. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I think so. Doctors, nurses, all health workers, ladies and gentlemen, let me at the outset thank Shernaz and Wispy for inviting me on behalf of the Asiatic Society to speak to you on this very auspicious day. To start with, I must express my deep gratitude to all the doctors, the frontline workers, all health workers, for the splendid job they are doing in fighting the wretched virus, the COVID-19 virus. Also my deep respects, remembrances, and also gratitude for all those health workers who laid down their life so that others may live. I have been asked to speak on medicine in Bombay down the ages. That means the past and the present. I think you are perfectly aware of the present. The doctors certainly are. And even if the lay people are not aware of the technicalities of medicine, they're aware of the broad outlook of medicine today, the advances of medicine today. So, for all practical purposes, I am going to just touch the present, but not dwell upon it. And I will deal with the past, because the past is indeed extremely important. How can you understand the present if you are not aware of the past? Just as future generations after us will never be able to clearly understand what's happened in their lifetime if they are not aware of the past and present. People believe that the past, present, and future are contiguous. Not so. Past, present, and future are intermingled with one another. That is what happens in the history of the world. And that is what applies also in the history of medicine. Now, when I consider the past, I am going to start from the 19th century, that is from 1800 onwards. Of course, Bombay, when it was fairly well populated, in the 18th century, that is in the 1700s, must have been visited by various diseases. What were the diseases of the past? there were infections all the time, infections which had no cure. Let me give a few generalizations. I propose to make this a very informal lecture, so I'm going to speak off the cuff. So forgive the lapses that I may have during this talk. The generalizations, well, though infections have existed in Bombay in the 19th century from 1800 onwards, they must have been there well before that when the city was reasonably well populated. And they must have caused a significant amount of decimation of the population. In fact, infections date prehistory in the world. They have been there for ages, ever since history started. The next point that I would like to mention is what were those infections? The main infections of the past were plague, cholera, smallpox, and malaria. There were others too which contributed to morbidity and mortality, but these were the main infections. Let me tell you that in the 19th century, these very infections that I spoke about were rampant, ravaged the West as well, as much as they did the East, as much as they did India and the city of Bombay. But by the time the 20th century dawned, in the West, they were under reasonable control. Why so? And why did we have to suffer a little more? The reason is there were endemic pockets of infection in the city and in the country. These endemic pockets kept diseases alive. And once in a way, sometimes often, sometimes not so often, they would burst this boundary and spread into the surrounding area, causing epidemics and even pandemics. Now, why should there have been such endemic areas? Basically, it was the interaction between man, between his environment, and the seed which produced the disease. That means the germ which produced the disease. There were also other very important factors which preserved this endemicity. The climate, the soil, the socio-economic conditions that prevailed. You can imagine the poverty we have now, you know it well enough. Imagine the poverty then, it was even worse. The cultural traditions, religious beliefs, the dogmas, the taboos, the superstitions, all these in our country and in our city prevented a good control of the disease, of the infection, and in fact led to its exacerbation and spread. I want to give you as an example of a classic epidemic in the past, and that is the epidemic of plague in 1896 and 1897. It is a prototype of a bad epidemic, and you may perhaps try and compare it with the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic that reigns today. There are many lay people here, so just let me give you a brief idea of what plague was about. Plague is a zoonotic infection, which means it affects animals or creatures outside human beings and is passed on to men, human beings, by a vector. It is the rat which is affected by the plague organism. It kills the rat in due course of time. Before that, the flea that feeds on the blood of the rat sucks the blood and gets infected. When the rat dies, the flea jumps off because there's no more blood to suck and latches on to any human being that is near. So to have plague, you must have plenty of infected rats, plenty of rats which are going to die, dying and dead. You have plenty of fleas there who are also infected, and you have large number of human beings around. And I'd like to tell you very briefly what the symptoms were, because nobody knew what exactly plague was caused by. It manifests itself in two forms. One was a swelling in the armpit or in the groin, which was called a bubo. Besides the swelling, they were so ill, they were so toxic, that in the plague of 1896-97, even bubonic plague killed in about 4 days' time. And there was another one, which was a pneumonic plague, where the organism infected the lung, and you coughed up these organisms, you spat out blood, you even passed it out when you just breathed it normally. And this was the most infectious of the lot. So in addition to the flea, you have the buboes, which when they suppurate are filled with organisms. And you have the pneumonic plague, where the air is contaminated by these organisms. So the spread is tremendous and epidemics arise. How did this epidemic arise in India? Remarkably enough, as expected, it arose in China. The Chinese refused to do much about the plague. They let them kill the Chinese inhabitants. They believed in the Confucian philosophy that families should not be separated from one another. The plague spread to the southeastern part of China, spread to the ports, to Hong Kong in particular, and it is via the sea lanes and sea traffic that they reached the port of Bombay, which is the most important port in the country. Well, then you have rats coming out of this ships which carried cargo in the port, warehouses, the rats scampered about, dying, fleas around, the rats scampering onto the thatched huts of the poor houses and also of ordinary houses, getting into the houses, dying there, and infecting human beings. That's how the epidemic arose. As always, the initial epidemic was thought to be nothing. It was all right, as was so in the province of Wuhan in China. But later on, it was realized that everybody was dying around. Men and women were dying like flies, like fleas also. So what was to be done? The Governor General in Delhi passed the same act as we had just now, the Epidemic Prevention Act. They closed the railways, they stopped all travel, just like before, just like now. No gatherings, no weddings, no funerals, except for the person and one or two people who attended the funeral. And it was chaos. The fact was that nobody wanted to go to the hospital. They hated the hospital. They thought they would die in the hospital, as many still feel in this part of the world. Therefore, the government and the municipality ordered that volunteers and members of the health force should knock on every door. If they didn't open it, smash the door open, examine patients there, and if they were sick, take them to the hospital. And those who were in contact were placed in quarantine in large tents outside the city, very much like what it was here. But imagine the social upheaval when this happened, when unknown people entered into houses, the burqa women, the ordinary women, when they were asked to expose their groin and their armpits to see if they had buboes there, if they had swellings in there. There was a great grievance, there was great trouble, there were riots. These people who were sick were carried out. It's amazing that the relatives hid their sick patients rather than letting them go into the hospital. They hid them under mattresses. They hid them under closets, in closets, almost to the point that they were suffocated. There were 800,000 people inhabiting Bombay at that point in time. 400,000 people ran away, managed to get away from Bombay. I'm reminded of the poor people, the migrants who left Bombay in the time of the COVID episode. The same fate overtook them. Many died on the way, and many spread the disease all over outside the city of Bombay, Bombay Presidency, even into Gujarat. This is how it was. Amazingly, the hospitals were attacked. The Arthur Road Hospital was the main hospital. They were all attacked. Riots followed. The riots were dispersed. by police. And the Arthur Road Hospital authorities said, but they come dying. What can we do? That was true. They came so late into hospital that by the time they reached hospital, and within a day or so, they expired. Perhaps it didn't matter, because after all, there was no cure for the plague. There were a number of charlatans who said they were plague specialists, who said they would cure the plague. They met their fate when they tried to do so. They also died of plague. Now, what was to happen? Amazingly, different communities set up different hospitals. The Parsi set up the Parsi hospital, the Khoja hospital, the Hindus, the Hindu hospital, the Jains, the Jain hospital. They said that the Parsi hospital, I'm not imagining this, they say that the Parsi hospital was the best managed and the cleanest of all the hospitals. But what was to be done? A man called Waldemar Haffkine was on the border of Bengal and Bihar researching on the treatment of cholera. He was approached by the Plague Research Council. Again, imagine the same setup that is here. You have several sort of setups to sort of try and see if they can help with the plague. The Surgeon General first said, no, there is no need for Haffkine to come here. When he resigned very shortly, the other Surgeon General was a rather erudite man. He examined the pus from the buboes and found organisms within it and said, no, this has to be the plague, actual plague. Therefore, send for Haffkine if he comes. Haffkine comes to Bombay. He is given a small office at the JJ Hospital in the pharmacology department. He has a few assistants. He goes to work, literally works day and night in a small, unventilated, rather poorly ventilated room. He examines the pus from the buboes, finds the organism. He had worked in the Pasteur Institute. And at that time, in the Pasteur Institute, 2 days before this plague, 2 years before this plague broke out, Yersin had managed to detect the germs that produce plague. And he had described them. Haffkine said that they were exactly the same. So he cultures them. At that time, there were no Petri dishes available. The culture was on broth. And he innovated, wanting to make the organisms grow faster by spreading a layer of ghee on top of the broth and a little coconut oil as well. And indeed, the plague bacilli grew faster and faster. He then made these plague bacilli well nigh avirulent by using heat, by repeated cultures and using repeated heat at a certain temperature, till he felt that these bacilli were no longer as virulent and you could make a vaccine out of it. He made the vaccine, but who was he to try it on? Like the great man that he was, he tried it on himself. He asked another colleague, a man called Dr. Surveyor, to give him 4 times the dose of the vaccine which he would use for ordinary purposes. He fell ill, but he recovered within 5 or 6 days' time. The vaccine was ready. There were very few takers. Till plague broke out in the jail at Arthur Road and in another small place where poor people were housed. And they asked for the vaccine because they saw their friends and people all around dying. So that was the first place where Haffkine tried his vaccine. Of course, he was pooh-poohed by all the people in Bombay, all the authorities in Bombay, including the IMS, which is the Indian Medical Service. It was mainly at that time Britishers with perhaps a few Indians. But then his work, the work that he did, was noticed by people of eminence. Robert Koch in Germany looked at his work and said it was good. Lister in London said it was excellent. Lister invites Haffkine to London to speak to the Royal Society. Queen Victoria knights him. He comes back, the vaccine is accepted, and a large number of people are vaccinated. Social workers, prominent leaders, all take the vaccines in public to stimulate the ordinary folks to do so. Slowly, Haffkine was accepted as a very great innovator and a discoverer. and he was made head of the Parel, they called it the Parel Research Laboratories, or something to that effect. In 1900, he was the head. You would have thought that was it, but there was something else to follow. I will now tell you a brief life story of two heroes in this play. One is, of course, Vladimir Haffkine, who was a Russian, born in Odessa, Crimea, which at that time belonged to Russia, and now it is Ukraine. He graduated with physics, mathematics, zoology, became a curator of a very large zoological museum in Odessa. At that time, around that time, Alexander III, the Romanovs were all murdered at the order of Vladimir Lenin, and the Jews, as usual, were implicated. They thought that they were what plotters behind this murder, which is obviously not true. So poor Haffkine was one of those who was indicted. He would have probably gone to the Gulag or would have been shot had it not been for one of his mentors, a man called Professor Mechnikov. The lay people won't know them, but the doctors will. He was the man who described the macrophage and the role of the macrophage in immunity and in the importance of immune response to infection. He was therefore acquitted. He ran away from Russia, short while in Geneva, then went to Paris and worked at the Pasteur laboratory. Not in the laboratory as such. He was first appointed just as an assistant librarian, but he begged that in his spare time, could he please go to the laboratory and work. It is there that he did his work on the cholera epidemic and the making of the cholera vaccine. And it was then that he went to Calcutta to do research on his vaccine in Calcutta, where a roaring epidemic of cholera was there. And it was from there that he went to Bombay for the plague. Well, as I said, he was at the top of his profession for all practical purposes. Then a disaster happened. Sometime 2 years later, when the vaccine was being used in a village in Punjab, 12 people died of tetanus. And they said that Haffkine's laboratory was responsible for it. And they said it was so because instead of using carbolic acid, he was using heat as a sterilizer. Little did these ignoramuses realize that the Pasteur Institute was using heat for more than 2 years. So he was defrocked. It was his response. And he was disgraced. And from Bombay, for a while, went to Calcutta. And from there to London. And he didn't know what to do with himself. Amazingly, the British in their own country were far more egalitarian and far more caring than those in Bombay. Great people there, Professor Simpson from King's College, Lister in London, Ronald Ross, who discovered the life cycles of malaria, looked into the problem, looked deeply into the problem, and said the contamination of tetanus was done in Punjab itself, when it was shown that a stopper of the vaccine had fallen on the ground and had been picked up by an unsterile forces. Of course, poor Haffkine remained more or less disgraced in the eyes of the Bombay presidency. He went for a short time to Calcutta, then returned to Switzerland, where he died. Just before he died, as a result of harrying the British Parliament, the Bombay people ultimately recognized him and named the Parel laboratory as the Haffkine Institute. They wrote to Haffkine. The man had no anger, no animosity. He very kindly said it was great that this has happened, and I'm very grateful. I have spent the best years of my life in the city of Bombay. So that was the real epidemic that shook Bombay city and its surroundings. 1896, 1897. Cholera. Cholera was even worse than plague. In the 19th century, there were not only epidemics of cholera, there were pandemics of cholera, 4 pandemics of cholera. And every year the pandemic lasted in different parts of the world, 1 million people died. So you can imagine the havoc it was. It all arose from Bengal. Why from Bengal? The alluvial soil, the moist climate, the rivers there, which carried the infected water to the Ganges, along the Ganges, and to people along the river banks. And of course, the dirt, the filth, and the poverty in the city of Calcutta. Now, here again, science comes to the rescue. It was Robert Koch who found the Vibrio cholera, that is a germ causing cholera, in a patient with cholera in Egypt, but nobody believed him. Then came the Calcutta epidemic. So Robert Koch was asked by the Koch Institute in Germany to go and find out what's happening. He goes there. He examines the cadavers of patients dying of cholera and found the same germ in the intestines of these cadavers. The genius was that there were so many organisms, but he could still, from them, identify that particular organism called the Vibrio. Called the Vibrio, why was it called Vibrio? Because it was not a straight organism, but a comma. Haffkine now also got to work on this Vibrio. He cultures the Vibrio in the Pasteur Institute, mind you. This was before the plague epidemic. He makes his vaccine. He makes the cholera germs avirulent. He takes the vaccine, first takes the vaccine on himself to show that it wouldn't kill anybody, that it was it didn't have many bad effects. He goes to Calcutta and literally, single-handed, with the help of about 8 or 10 Indian volunteers and Indian doctors, he manages to vaccinate thousands of people in cholera. That is how the cholera epidemic, which became a pandemic, was halted to an extent in the city of Calcutta and in the province of Bengal. We come next to the other one, the smallpox, which fortunately by 1974 is extinct in the world, but it was perhaps the worst infection of all. Decimated populations, more than any other epidemic. And again, it was a man named Jenner, Edward Jenner, an ordinary general practitioner who observed that those milkmaids who milk cows, and if those cows had cowpox and they got cowpox, they would never get smallpox. It was from that simple, basic observation that the smallpox vaccine was made. And it was that vaccine which initiated, ultimately, the demise of this most dreadful malady. When we come to malaria, malaria killed at least 1 million people a year or more in India alone, leave aside in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, there was no vaccine against malaria. There is no vaccine against malaria for the simple reason that the malarial parasite changes its genome all the time. So with all the expertise that we have, all the advances that we have today, even today, it has not been possible to conclusively get a vaccine which can prevent malaria. But it was a scientist again who told us how the Anopheles mosquito could cause malaria, the life cycle of malaria. The main man was Ronald Ross. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, this man wanted to be a poet, and it was under parental pressure that he became a doctor. And when he found the full life cycle of the malarial parasite, he was so excited that he wrote to his wife in verse, "Oh, that horrible little thing, I know 1 million men will slay. Oh, death, where is thy sting, thy victory, O grave?" So that's how it was. Now, there were other diseases, childhood diseases, there again, whether it was diphtheria, whether it was measles, which had a high morbidity and mortality. Again, the way they was controlled were through vaccines. I would like, however, to tell you who was the man who gave the idea that it was vaccination that could prevent the disease. He was a great man, one of the greatest of the 10 scientists over the world till recent times. His name was Louis Pasteur. He made a profound statement after his experimental work that he did. I won't say that, it's too long, but he made the statement that miasmas, vapors, impurities do not cause disease. That's what it was believed, even in plague, even in cholera. It is a microorganism that causes a disease. And a single microorganism causes a particular disease. And if you could grow that organism, you could make a vaccine. And if you gave that vaccine to the patient, he would be prevented from getting that disease. And he showed that in anthrax, and most important of all, he showed that in rabies, which was is still a dreadful disease, but which hopefully can usually be prevented by the use of the vaccination or the vaccine that Pasteur produced. So that's how it was. Now we come to the beginning of the 20th century. These were all preventive measures, and of course, prevention is better than cure. But did they have medicines? Did they have any cures? No, unfortunately not, except for the few that I will tell you in a moment. The doctors bled their patients, they purged their patients, they sweated their patients, they sometimes starved their patients, and they thought that they would cure disease. Unfortunately, more doctors killed patients than cured. Were there any cures? Yes, there were a few. One was digitalis for the heart. A Shropshire woman tells a practitioner in Shropshire that, my dear sir, use this foxglove when your patients are filled with water, when they have edema, then their abdomens are filled with water. He listened to her. He used foxglove. Now, from foxglove comes digitalis, and this is a very valuable drug even today in patients with heart disease. What else was there? There was, from the bark of the wood of a tree present in Peru, they were able, the willow bark, as I said, they managed to get salicylates, which was good for fever. And from the cinchona bark, they managed to get quinine, which was responsible for all fevers, particularly fevers with chills, with many of them being related to malaria. And of course, there was that great drug, opium, a panacea for many things, a panacea for all pains, for all time, which is still a very important drug today. These were the only drugs that medicine had. So we go further. We come to a great epidemic in the 20th century, a great pandemic, the Spanish flu. It resembles really the COVID-19 pandemic. It was really transmitted through cough, droplets infected, inhaled by people, and they got the flu. How does it compare with the present flu? Perhaps it was worse than the present flu. At that time, this was 1918, 1919, towards the end of the First World War. They said that 50 million people died of the Spanish flu. The current review is that perhaps 80 to 100 million died of the Spanish flu. How much has the COVID flu killed? 7 million and 750,000 or something like that. 4 million, 750,000 or something like that. Even if you take this as an underestimate, double that, it will be close to 8 or 10 million, but it's nowhere near 80 to 100 million. I only hope that the COVID virus does not go the way of the Spanish flu. There are some differences also. It was the most fulminant form of Spanish flu, was more fulminant than what you get with the COVID flu. People who sometimes got up in the morning died the next day. The one thing that COVID did not do is to produce acute pulmonary edema. Death in many of these fulminant cases in the Spanish flu was acute hemorrhagic pulmonary edema. And another thing which was different was that the virus didn't only produce a pneumonia, it made way for secondary infection invariably, almost always. And the infection spread to the pleural space, producing pus within the pleura. So these were some of the differences. I don't want to go into the technicalities of that because I know there are a number of lay people here. So that was the 1819 epidemic. When did modern medicine actually begin? You must remember, you can't just isolate Bombay as a city. By that time, there were connections with major cities all over the world. So when did modern medicine begin? Modern medicine began with the discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming. That was in 1927 or so. He found that a petri dish where he was growing staphylococci, bugs which cause severe infection, was contaminated by fungi. And where the fungi touched the growth of the bacterium, the organisms were lysed, they were destroyed. Obviously, the fungus was secreting something doing that. He didn't throw it away as you and I would do that and say it's contaminated, let's take another dish. He analyzed the fungus and found that it contained a substance called penicillin, which he called penicillin. He worked on that. He wrote a little on that. He showed that it could kill bugs of a particular kind. And that was it. His writing in a journal ultimately was in the archives of a library, and there it lay for a long time. It was in the 30s that Florey and Chain in Oxford were looking at a drug which would kill bugs, and they found Fleming's work, and they repeated that work, and they found, yes, penicillin, this fungus secreted a substance which would kill certain organisms. They tried to make a fair amount of it, but it was very difficult to do so. They went therefore to America, and they told them, look, this is a war. If you can get this drug on a mass scale, you would save millions of lives because it kills organisms which are found in wounds, etc. Roosevelt was there. He gave an order that this should be done on a wartime scale. Penicillin was manufactured. It was ready for delivery on D-Day. It saved the lives of millions of soldiers. The Nazis were unaware of this, and it was one factor which made the Allies win the war. And then came a plethora of drugs, a plethora of antibiotics, one after the other, after the other, after the other. So you find modern medicine keeping up from that point in time. Now, I must tell you one very amazing thing. Wars are extremely destructive, kill many people. But from the cruel cauldron of war, from the brimstone of war, medicine had some important benefits. One, as I told you, was of course the discovery of penicillin. Had it not been for the war, it would have been there, laid aside, nobody would have bothered about it. But there were so many other things. You will be surprised. All the specialties that we see today in medicine and surgery were born and bred in the battlefields of mainly the Second World War. The management of shock, the treatment of wounds, emergency care, critical care medicine, all sorts of various specialties, whether it was orthopedics, plastic surgery, other surgeries, various medical specialties. They all came from the battlefields of the Second World War. And all those who were in charge of that, when the war finished and they took their civil responsibilities, headed these special departments. That's how specialties grew. So from the cauldron of war, evil came some good. This is as if evil can never always suppress some good. So that is what it was. And now you have a new set of infections coming in. The HIV pandemic, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, all over the world, including Bombay. What else? You had polio in the 50s, which crippled so many people. And again, Salk and Sabine, who prepared a vaccine for them. So many children saved from this disease. Polio is still present in some small areas in the world, but almost certainly it is likely to be extinct in a short period of time. And don't forget tuberculosis. Tuberculosis has always been a killer for years, all over the world, including the West. It was the HIV pandemic which made tuberculosis raise its ugly head even more. Because the HIV virus suppressed immunity. And that is where tuberculosis came in. Patients with HIV developed tuberculosis. And the death rate from both these conditions was marked. Now, initially, tuberculosis was treated by drugs. And at the time, the first drugs, it was in 1956-57, I remember. And if the patient took the drugs properly, the cure rate was close to 95 or 96%. But now you find that the organism, the mycobacterium tubercle, became increasingly resistant to drugs, partly because people were not so compliant. Why were they not so compliant? Because the treatment lasted for a long time, 9 months at least, sometimes even a year. Also, it occurred amongst the poor people, amongst migrant people, who often took some treatment and went away to another part of the city or to other part of the country and stopped treatment. So you had resistant tuberculosis, first to a single drug, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, make treatment extremely difficult. And then, of course, you have now a tubercle, a form of, or rather a mycobacterium, which is resistant to almost all drugs that we have. Now, this is really a dangerous thing. And the city of Bombay, particularly, crowded with so many people, with so many having multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, all amongst the poor, all amongst crowded people, all amongst people who have little sanitation, all amongst people who have poor nutrition. You are sitting on a powder. So I think those who are looking after these dangerous tubercle, the multi-drug resistant tubercle resistant to almost drugs, deserve our salute as well. Zari, are you listening? What then now?
It's frozen. They can hear you.
Let me now get on to what happened.
Just as if they can hear you, the screen is frozen.
The screen is frozen, my friend is saying here.
Yeah, the screen is frozen.
The screen is frozen.
Can you change it?
No, I think there must be some little connectivity problem at your side.
Fine. Let me go on, frozen or unfrozen, please. Okay. And now you also find a change in the spectrum of disease. Of course, infections persist. Infections will never go. You are living in amity, if I may say so, with a biosphere of microorganisms you can't see. These microorganisms have been in the world for millions of years before Homo sapiens appeared. And just as Charles Darwin said, it's the survival of the fittest, so it is with these microorganisms. If you kill them, they change their genomic structure and they become resistant to the drug that you are using. And ultimately you find that they are resistant, become resistant cleverly to everything that you're using. And you find resistant organisms in the world, not just tubercle, but all other organisms which can play havoc with you and which can decimate populations. We are in a state at this point of time where gram-negative organisms are resistant to all the antibiotics or almost all the antibiotics we have, so that if you have that infection, you are doomed to die. That's as far as the infections go. And also the change in the spectrum of disease. Besides infections, you have heart diseases, you have coronary artery diseases, you have hypertension, you have metabolic diseases like diabetes. India is the maximum number of patients with diabetes. You have degenerative diseases of the nervous system. You have Alzheimer's. You have respiratory diseases, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or we would call it chronic bronchitis. And of course, you have the increasing incidence of cancer. First described, believe me, by Hippocrates. He called it karkinos. The meaning of the karkinos, it's a Greek word, the meaning is crab. I suppose it just says, perhaps wraps its claws around you and kills you. I can only think of that analogy when you think of cancer as a crab. And we have treatment for that. But I think cancer is probably stitched into the genome of humankind. Will it be possible to unstitch that gene? I really do not know. But there are forms of cancer which are now curable. We have made inroads in the treatment of cancer, but we have miles to go before we can say they have done a great deal of good in this particular regard. My mind somehow or the other comes back again to this COVID virus. What has the pandemic of COVID virus and its communicability and its infectivity taught us. The virus has no preferences. It treats everyone in the same manner, whether he's a king or a pauper, a rich or a poor, clever or an idiot, an ordinary man or an extraordinary man. We are all in the same boat, more or less. And what was the human reaction to this? To an extent, it was me and my family, then my community, and then the people of my country. I don't think that would get us far in another pandemic, and it hasn't got us far in this pandemic. It is important that we look at an infective agent like this in a more broader sense, concerning ourselves not just with the country in which it is flared up or which is there, but in relation to humanity as a whole. Humanity as a whole, meaning care and concern for the rest of the world. Then perhaps only would you meet this challenge in a better way. How would I call it? I would call it a globalization of care. A globalization of care and concern for humanity. Remembering, and here I quote, that you are as strong as the weakest link. So if you have even one weak link, the organism can still beat you. This is how it is. Let me now concern myself with the new advances that we have. I said I'll touch on it. I just would mention a few things. Transplants, joint replacements, surgeries, laparoscopic surgery, robotic surgery. The surgeon can touch his finger into every nook and corner of the body. Various drugs to fight various diseases. I think, for example, cortisone, a valuable drug, even if it doesn't cure, it often controls very well. Insulin for diabetes, oral hypoglycemic drugs who don't need insulin, and so many other drugs, so many antibiotics, a plethora of them. In fact, an overuse of them, an overkill with these antibiotics so that we get drug-resistant organisms. Of course, I think medicine is responsible for the greatest benefit to mankind. There's no doubt about that. Just think of what you would have been if you didn't have the medicine that you have now. But look at the other side of midnight or the other side of day, or the other, look at night instead of looking at day. And there are certain things which one needs to know about medicine. The effects which are not as good. The effects you would not like. And what are they? Let me briefly summarize them. Ivan Illich said that medicine has produced three major disadvantages. And in any case, he's rather very drastic. He said medicine is, according to him, has done more harm to man than good. I don't believe that for an instant. I'm sure if Ivan Illich falls ill, he will take to modern medicine. Ivan Illich said it produces first a medical iatrogenesis. Iatros is a physician, genesis is to make. Diseases produced by physicians in the hospital. Why? It's possible and it's very necessary and it's very obvious. The number of drugs which are poisonous, the number of procedures which are done which have numerous side effects, the number of dangerous operations, that sometimes cost the patient his life. Sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes the person has not considered the cost and the benefit. So there are many side effects produced by medicine itself, by the large number of medicines which have poisonous effects, and also the large number of invasive procedures that you see in the world today. And Ivan Illich, consults all the peer medical journals and gives facts and figures to prove it. The next thing that he says is social iatrogenesis. Social iatrogenesis, he says, is when the profession has so built itself that for every little thing, the patient or the individual will go run to the doctor or run to the hospital. He says that's good for the medical profession, but it's bad for society as such. And the third thing that he said was cultural iatrogenesis. And this is indeed bad. Cultural iatrogenesis, and modern medicine believes that you must keep the patient alive at all costs till he stops breathing or his heart stops pumping. This is dangerous and this is tragic, because if one really does that, one merely prolongs the act of dying, making it miserable, agonizing, financial ruin to the patient and his relatives. People now, doctors now realize that, and they understand that there are limits to medicine beyond which it is pointless to proceed. Are there any other disadvantages to modern medicine? Yes. A dreadful fall in the ethics of medicine. I'm thinking of the days prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. A dreadful fall in the ethics of medicine. Why so? If doctors put the lucre of money or the acquisition of power before the care and the comfort of their patient, ethics falls by the wayside. It dies by the wayside. I'm reminded of a famous quote: "Do not enter the temple of science with the soul of a moneylender." That's a beautiful saying. Is there anything else? Yes, there is something else. The glitter and glamour of modern medicine, the new machines, the gadgetry, etc., so enwraps the modern physician that he pays less attention to the patient as a whole. I think, in a way, the great advances of science, important as they are, no one doubts their importance, has somehow, in some way, dehumanized medicine. And humanism is the raison d'etre of medicine. I feel rather sorry about that. The doctor does not have that much rapport with his patient as much as he has with his machines. No longer is the doctor-patient relationship so sound and so complete and so unbreakable. On the contrary, this lack of humanism has led to a weakening of the doctor-patient relationship, which is at the core of medicine. What is this relationship? It is a trusting relationship between the doctor and the patient, hallowed by time. So these are some of the disadvantages that you see. And when you are so immersed in the science of medicine, you forget its art. But medicine is in equal measure an art and a science. Let me quote William Osler of the 20th century, the first quarter of the 20th century, when he said, medicine, the art of medicine is based, the science of medicine is based on possibility, and the art of medicine is based on probability. Medicine is in equal measure an art and a science. Let me end now by quoting my own words from my own book. What is the art of medicine? The art of medicine, I think, is the application of its science to the holistic overall care of an individual patient. The art of medicine is the art of healing, not just treating, not even just curing. Thank you.
Farokh, bada nahi samjhayo usse?
Yeah, but the screen is black.
Yeah, kind of screen, but they didn't hear me.
Yes, we could all hear properly. And doctor, you can now try and just put on your screen again. You can
I'm
please
trying.
start your video again. Yeah.
It says cannot start video, fail to start the video. Please select another video camera and settings. So I'd have to
Okay, so
log
something
out.
has failed at your side, I think.
I'd have to log out and log in again if that happens. Let's see. I think, no, it'd be risky. I think you want to finish your questions and answers.
Madhu?
Yeah, I think we'll take the questions. There are quite a few that have been posed over here. So I'll start them one by one. There is a question by Farha. Will COVID end and when? Is vaccination safe and by how much %?
Sorry, what did you say about vaccination?
When will COVID
Madhu,
end?
you're not very clear.
Okay, so the first question is, will COVID-19 end and when? And is vaccination safe and by how much %?
COVID will of course end. There is no epidemic in the world, no pandemic in the world which has gone on forever. They have to end. Either the epidemic results in the death of many people, or infects many people who recover and they are immune then. And there are some who are naturally immune. And ultimately, when more than 70% of people have developed an immune mechanism to resist the disease, the epidemic ends. By the way, the world's worst epidemic was in the 14th century. It was a plague. It was a plague which decimated the population of Europe, which lasted for a number of years, which destroyed 1/4 of the population of Europe and infected 1/3 of its population. But ultimately, it also ended. So it has to end. I can't tell you when it ends. I told you, the way you look and react to the pandemic is important. If you say it's me first, my family first, my community first, my children first, America first, England first, Germany first, that's a wrong approach. You have to have an approach which cares for the greater part of humanity. Without that, a pandemic will last much longer than what it otherwise would have done. As I said, you need a globalization of care, because you must remember that you are as strong as the weakest link. And unless you take everyone into consideration, it's been beautifully put by a poet, which I think I should have told you. He said, each man's death diminishes me, for I am concerned with all mankind. So ask not of me for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Beautifully expressed. It tells you, this is by John Donne, and it tells you that unless you care for everyone around you, things will never be the same. Vaccination, how safe it is safe, you must take it. You have to take it, barring very rare exceptions. It is difficult to say how long it covers you, how long your immunity lasts. That has to be seen, I think. It's difficult to say when you will need a booster dose. Almost certainly you will. If you ask me when will the COVID-19 epidemic end, I think when most people are vaccinated in all parts of the world. Because if one part is left out, that's your weakest link. And you are as strong as that weakest link.
There is a next question by Azmeen Kasad who says, what do you see as the future of the COVID-19 pandemic on mankind and especially in India?
Future of the pandemic on mankind, effect on
Future of the pandemic in mankind, all great pandemics have a dreadful effect. besides destroying the individual and the number of individuals who are infected badly, it has a great mental trauma for those who have been badly hurt and have recovered. And you see that all the time. You see that all the time. Besides, of course, destroying the economy of the country, besides taking away jobs from most people, besides having the psychological stress of not being allowed to live a normal life, all these are great bad points for any epidemic.
Sharon Irani wants to know more on the work of Dr. Acacio Gabriel Vegas in Bombay and Alexander Yersin in Hong Kong that preceded the work of Vladimir Haffkine on the plague vaccine.
I forgot to tell you the story of a great hero in the plague. And he was a Parsi gentleman, you won't believe it, whose name was Nasirwanji Hormusji Choksi. He was in charge of the Arthur Road Hospital. And he worked there with all the plague victims without hesitation, with great dedication. He caught the plague in 1987. Was it 87 to 89. He caught the plague in 1987. And he was given Yersin's vaccine. Yersin prepared antibodies to the plague by injecting the plague into horses and then taking the antitoxin of the antibodies from the horses, from the serum, and then using that as a weapon against the plague. Just like people here, then in this way, wanted the plasma of people who had recovered from it. Very much like that, but this is not from men, but from animals. And he believes, this man, Nasirwanji Hormusji Choksi, believes that perhaps it was this vaccine that saved his life. And what is more, he did something wonderful. He took 1,000 patients after this. He took 1,000 patients to 500. On alternately, he took 500 and 500. On every alternate patient, he gave this vaccine of Alexander Lutzi, the serum of Alexander, not the vaccine. You're making a mistake. He didn't make a vaccine. He made a serum. And he tried it out on all these people in a rather scientific. It was a random, in a way, a randomized trial, but not a double-blind randomized trial. And he wrote his work. And he said that the serum had no action whatsoever on the pulmonary form of plague. But it reduced the mortality in the bubonic plague from 70% at times to about 45 to 50%. And he also said it had no major bad effects. He wrote this up in some of the best journals. I didn't know that. In the BMJ, in the Lancet. His work was praised tremendously. He was decorated by many people and by many countries for this great work.
Ashok Vaidya has made a statement and he wants your views. The discovery of Rauwolfia serpentina led to a watershed of new drugs discovery for depression, Parkinson's disease, galactoria, etc. because of the side effects noticed. Dr. Gananath Sen and Dr. Rustam Jal Vakil made a great contribution. So what are your views on this?
Absolutely right. Rustam Jal Vakil was my teacher. And it was my term during in the KM hospital where I did my graduation and my post-graduation that his work on serpentina was indeed recognized. Of course, it was a valuable drug at that time because perhaps it was the first drug that was really introduced for the treatment of hypertension. But there's so many drugs that followed after it that this drug now is barely ever used. But it was a great contribution, unquestionably.
There is a question by Nishit Kumar. Doctor, what impact do you expect artificial intelligence will have on the practice of medicine?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Artificial intelligence on the practice of medicine.
Oh, my leg. Oh, good. You know, artificial intelligence will perhaps compute much better than the present computer that you have. But just imagine, if you have a problem and you tell the artificial intelligence machine Please solve it for me. He solves it for you. Well, good enough. But if you continue to do that, what happens to your brain? It atrophies, my dear lady. It atrophies. You won't think properly. Would you like a situation like that? Of course, use artificial intelligence, but it has to be done with discretion. And can artificial intelligence communicate with a patient? Do you have a metallic hand on you, or do you have a human hand feeling you when you're very ill? There are problems, and there are good signs, and there is a bad side to artificial intelligence. But it will be there as we go along in a bigger and bigger way. There's no question about that.
The question from Ayush. So what are your views on the future of medicine?
The future, Quo vadis medicine, as I put it, whither goes the medicine? It's a debatable question. I think medicine is going to be more and more machine-oriented. Medicine is going to become more and more mechanical, more and more dehumanized. And there will come a point in time when the patient will say, please, will you have a doctor who can listen to me carefully and reply to me carefully? And will you have a doctor who can feel me with his hands?
There is a question from Thomas Varugis. Won't you think everything in medicine will finally be precision medicine?
What is it? Sorry, I didn't hear you. Precision.
Don't you think everything in medicine will finally be precision medicine?
Is what medicine?
Precision.
Precision.
Precision. Medicine, my dear lady, I told you, is both an art and a science. True, science will add to precision. Of course, it will add to precision. But if you take science alone and take away its art, medicine would have lost its most human values. Of course, it will add to precision, unquestionably.
There is a question from Azmeen. She says, having suffered from malaria repeatedly, I'm wondering why there has been no vaccine created for malaria yet.
I told you, my dear lady, it's not created because the genome of the malarial parasite is even cleverer than the genome of the COVID-19 virus. It changes all the time. It changes all the time. So the vaccine which might be effective at one moment in time is ineffective at another moment in time. There is a lot of work all over the world on trying to get a malaria vaccine. Many vaccines have been tried out, mind you, with great hope, only to fail. Still, at this point in time, they are saying that sooner or later, at least, if not sooner, later, a vaccine against malaria will indeed come about.
Sairaj Nirbhavni has a question. So why is it that Western countries have suffered more life damage due to the pandemics so far in decades?
Sorry, what is it?
Why is it that Western countries have suffered more damage of life due to the pandemics?
I don't think that's really correct, if you ask me. Haven't we suffered a great deal of damage? India, for example, is, I think, the second most country with the maximum number of deaths, or is it climbing right up to the top, beating United States and Brazil? The total number of deaths produced by the COVID virus today is 4.7 million. You double that because not all information is correct. Very often in poorer countries, information is incorrect or even hidden. Double that and it would come to about 9 or 10 million at the outside, which is much, much less than the 80 to 100 million killed over a period of a year and a quarter in the Spanish flu pandemic.
There is a question from Neville Saldana. Talking about globalization, do medical task force and other bodies set up by countries talk to each other, share information to combat the pandemic?
Of course they should. Of course they should. I think they are sharing it now. But I don't know how much they shared. For example, it's widely believed that China didn't share the origin of the epidemic and the degree of epidemic when it really started. It is widely believed that there were many cases in Wuhan with this epidemic which were not reported. and it widely believed that the poor Chinese doctor who first reported this was hounded, victimized. Poor man, he ultimately died of this virus.
There is a second question by him. Secondly, how does Johns Hopkins University get their daily worldwide stats?
Johns Hopkins University.
We get the daily information.
You said why did John?
How does it?
How do they get the statistics daily?
I really am not sure. Obviously, they are fed data which allows them to get these statistics. And obviously, they have great statisticians there. And obviously, they make models from the statistics they receive at a particular time as to what is happening in the near future. That's how it is.
I think that was the last question. Any more questions from the audience? Doctor, a lot of compliments from the audience. And okay, one last question, Professor Sawant. Do you expect any residual effects of COVID-19 vaccines?
Of the vaccine? No. You know, there are, as you know, there have been reports of blood clots occurring in various parts of the body. They have, many have said that this is a rare side effect or a rare danger of the vaccine. And if you have a blood clot which impairs the circulation of blood to a vital organ, obviously you will have great sequelae. You will have damage to that organ. So it does, but it occurs rarely.
Two more questions. Is it okay to mix and match a booster shot?
This has been worked upon, and there's a lot of work now going on to suggest that yes, perhaps a mixing of the different vaccines at different times might help you to get a better immune response.
One last question. Why do the new age doctors not focus on the patient's nutrition like you do?
It's sad because they don't talk to the patient. They don't look at the patient carefully. They're looking at disease organs. They compartmentalize medicine into different organ systems instead of looking at the patient as a whole. If they looked at the patient as a whole, they would realize that nutrition is an extremely important factor in the recovery of a patient who's suffering from a serious disease.
I'm sorry, I have missed two questions. There is a question from Percy Master. Will there be a cure for Alzheimer in the future?
There's a lot of work going on. There's some work that is suggested now, which has been approved by the FDA, actually, for use, at least in America, for Alzheimer's. I forget the name, it's a long name, but it has a fair amount of side effects so far. But it couldn't have been approved by the FDA unless they felt that it was worth trying it out amongst a number of people with Alzheimer's disease. I have a feeling that sooner or later, there will be something which will at least hold the advance of this dreadful disease.
Another question by Philly Karkaria. Can pregnant women take the vaccine?
I think it's not determined as yet whether pregnant women, unless there's something I've missed.
First trimester this year.
First trimester, certainly not.
Okay, let's take the last few questions. Doctor, can only one dose and not the second? If not taken, what will happen?
If you don't take the second dose, you are not really immune to the disease. Your immunity is not good enough. First of all, after you've taken the first dose, for the immunity to start, it takes about 14 or 15 days to start. And unless you've taken the second dose, your immunity wears off. So you're not well protected. You're likely to get the disease if exposed to it.
There is yet another question from Azmeen Kasat. Is there any cure for irritable bowel syndrome?
Ah, yes. Yes. Peace of mind. Peace of mind. Getting rid of your anxiety. Thinking good thoughts. Walking every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning. Listening to good music. and realizing that when you even have symptoms from that, it is a nuisance rather than a disease.
So I think with this, we can end the Q&A session. On behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I would like to thank Dr. Farokh Udwadia for this rather fascinating talk on epidemics, disease, medicine in Bombay. Doctor, you have left us with a large number of points to ponder upon: globalization of care, the limitations of modern medicine, ethics in medicine, and so on. We would also like to thank Mr. Sirvai for sparing his valuable time for this talk. And of course, the very large audience that gathered here rather patiently to attend the talk. I take this opportunity to request all Bombayites and the non-Bombayites as well to support the cultural institutions like Asiatic Society of Mumbai and become its members. So with this, we end the session. The recording will be available after a couple of days. So those of you who may have missed out certain portions of the lecture of this talk can listen to it via the recording.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and good night, everyone.
Doctor, can you now try and just put on your video again? I think everyone would like to see you again.
It's not working unless I log off and log on again.
No, then I don't think now it's
not worth it.
Not worth it. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Get it.